Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be here. The upcoming 700 megahertz auction, if structured and managed appropriately, represents a tremendous opportunity for the FCC to help deliver broadband capabilities to all areas of the United States. Because of the characteristics of the 700 megahertz spectrum, I believe it will be economical to deploy broadband services to many rural areas that would otherwise have been uneconomical to serve. That's why the segment of our industry has argued so strenuously that it's essential for Congress and the FCC to develop policies that will ensure rural carriers have access to 700 megahertz spectrum, and in particular the 700 megahertz auction. My fear is that, consistent with past practices, large nationwide telecommunications carriers will be in the best position to win many of these licenses, and will soon be auctioned, and they will once again overlook rural towns and their outlying areas, concentrating on the most profitable, highly populated areas. While such a market-based approach to the provision of broadband is understandable, it's not justifiable when there are small and rural companies ready and willing to provide service to such rural areas, and I suggest that rural carriers and rural businesses have different incentives when it comes to their region's economic survival. Bringing new businesses and jobs to my service area is a win-win situation. The FCC's current plan for auctioning and licensing the 700 megahertz band by design limits opportunities for small businesses to participate. Small businesses have no opportunity to acquire the huge C-block licenses in the auction, and the FCC's construction requirements do not encourage the large C-block licenses to work with small business. And I may interject the discussion just now about the build-out requirements. As proposed, the build-out requirements are more burdensome on the small carrier than the large carrier. A far better approach for small business would be for the FCC to license the spectrum based on smaller license areas than the huge regional areas. Instead of creating licenses so large that only multi-billion-dollar companies can bid on them, the division of the spectrum across the smaller CMA divisions would allow for fair and equal participation by all size companies. Also, the FCC should change the current construction requirements for the C block from population-based benchmarks to geographic-based benchmarks. This would encourage large licenses to work with small businesses to maximize the deployment of service to secondary and rural markets. In addition, the FCC and Congress should ensure that, to the extent services provided using the 700 megahertz spectrum are mobile or portable, the customers of small carriers are able to roam on the networks to be built by the nationwide carriers. The FCC and Congress should ensure that nationwide carriers do not deny their own customers the ability to roam in rural areas where there is a small business carrier that is providing technically compatible services. Another way the FCC can ensure that rural citizens have access to new 700 megahertz based applications is to require open access on the entire 700 megahertz platform and all future auctions of spectrum intended for personal communication services. If large nationwide carriers are allowed to dominate the 700 megahertz auction, they will control massive amounts of spectrum. Such concentration in the hands of a few goes against the entire grain of Section 309J and the Communications Act and seems contrary to congressional intent. We question the benefit to the public of allowing large carriers with huge budgets to gather spectrum with the potential purpose of preventing its use by others. There's no question that rural carriers, more than others, need less burdensome regulations. As a regulatory agency, the FCC is charged with giving particular consideration to whether or not its rules will negatively impact small carrier and particularly rural telephone companies. We can't honestly think of one instance in which the Commission ever outlined in a final order that it found circumstances that warranted adopting different rules for small carriers. We ask, how can this be? Instead of discouraging small businesses, the FCC should carefully study the impact of its regulations on small businesses and should ensure that rules and policies encourage small and rural businesses to deploy broadband services. By instituting the suggestions I've outlined today, which we have repeatedly made in formal presentations and filings with the FCC, policymakers could encourage the deployment of broadband connectivity to rural citizens and rural businesses with high-speed connections throughout America and we can expect to see small business growth in the development of rural America.